The Witcher 3 is one of the best games ever made. I can say that with some confidence. I've played a lot of games over the last 3.5 decades. I know what I like, I'm not overly nostalgic about old games, and I've spent a lot of time playing and analysing The Witcher 3 in some detail. The Witcher 3's DLC, consisting of Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine, is probably the best DLC ever made. I had to insert the word probably there, not because I especially doubt the quality on offer or am weighing it up against other excellent pieces of DLC, but simply because I don't actually play DLC or expansions all that often. Whereas I could easily prepare lists of top games by genre or release year, I would struggle to do the same with DLC. I still recognise quality when I see it, I just don't have a lot of perspective. This isn't due to some petty grudge against the mere concept of DLC. I'm old enough to remember when DLC was referred to as expansion packs and generally represented hefty chunks of content. I certainly own plenty of DLC. Up until I started this channel 3 years ago, I was never in a rush to play the latest and greatest experiences, and to a certain extent I'm still not. By the time I get around to buying games, the complete version is often available at such a discounted price that it's almost silly not to spend a few extra dollars to get the season pass. However, as many of you can probably attest, owning a game and playing a game are not the same thing. DLC is often sold with games that have above average play times to complete. It's often structured such that you either need to complete the base game first or are expected to have done most of the main content before attempting it. Either way, by the time I get to the point where I'm ready to play the DLC, I'm usually done with the game and ready to move on to something new. It's rare to finish a modern AAA game and be left wanting more of that game. The Witcher 3 is a huge game, and yet I wanted more when I finished it, a lot more. The DLC absolutely delivered, providing two completely different and yet equally special experiences. Hearts of Stone is an epic story with little in the way of combat, and it doesn't add much of note to the existing systems. It's set in the same world as the base game and only has a handful of new beasts to fight and optional quests to complete. However, that main story is absolutely fantastic and carries the entire experience. Blood and Wine, on the other hand, is almost an entirely new game. There's a new playable world, a new system of mutations to add onto the skill tree, more new monsters, lots of side quests, and even more filler content such as abandoned areas and monster nests. The story is fun but less ambitious and ultimately less memorable than that of Hearts of Stone. When it comes to RPGs, I'm very much a story first guy, as is probably evident in many of my videos, so you'd probably expect me to prefer Hearts of Stone out of the two. However, Blood and Wine was actually my favourite. Blood and Wine is more of the same. It's more of what Witcher 3 provided in abundance. It has a nice cosy ending. It's pure fan service. But I'm a fan and I loved it. Maybe I can cheat a bit and say that while Blood and Wine is my favourite, Hearts of Stone is probably the best. It's the critically acclaimed work versus the pop culture blockbuster that is Blood and Wine. Hearts of Stone is in many ways the culmination and perhaps perfection of what CD Projekt Red has been doing since the very first Witcher game, namely merging the characters and world of The Witcher with classic Polish folk stories and legends. CD Projekt Red has adapted a few classic stories already in the Witcher games, but never quite as directly and obviously as with Hearts of Stone. The deal with the devil that takes centre stage in Hearts of Stone immediately brings to mind the German story of Faust. However, it's more accurate to say that Hearts of Stone is a retelling of the Polish story Pan Twardowski, which itself was based on Faust. In the Polish version, Twardowski sells his soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge and magic. Of course, Twardowski doesn't want to give his soul to the devil, so he inserts a clause in the contract stating that the devil can only collect upon the agreement when Twardowski is in Rome, a city that Twardowski never intends to visit. Twardowski thought he was being clever, but it's not easy to outwit the devil. One day, while Twardowski was staying in a hotel, the devil turned up to collect, at which point Twardowski pointed out the Rome clause in the contract. Unbeknownst to Twardowski, the name of the hotel he was staying in happened to be Rome. Not the city, of course, but the contract wording wasn't all that specific. In some versions of the legend, Twardowski ended up on the moon because he was saved by the Virgin Mary while being carried away by the devil. This story could easily have been knocked out as a side quest in the main game. There are plenty of similar folk tales retold over an hour or two. However, with an entire piece of DLC dedicated to one story over around 10 hours, there's a lot of time to flesh out the characters involved, including the devil himself, and to host the triumphant return of one of my favourite characters from the first game, Shani. In fact, even though the two main players are the devil and a man with a heart of stone, this short story ends up being surprisingly character driven. Things start off with a simple monster contract to kill a large toad in the sewers. Local rumour has it the toad is in fact a prince, so women are venturing into the sewers hoping to kiss their way to the crown, only to end up being killed. While investigating, Geralt bumps into Shani from the first game and the books, and she goes on to play a major part in this DLC. Geralt fights and kills the toad, who as luck would have it was a prince after all. He was a member of Ophiri royalty, and Ophiri guards promptly show up to arrest Geralt and take him back to their homeland where he will inevitably be executed. Enter the devil. Well, he's probably the devil. Given the source of inspiration for this story plus his actions in the game, we can assume as much, although the exact nature of this being is never confirmed. In the game, he goes by the name Gaunt O'Dim, which has the initials GOD, God. CD Projekt Red certainly likes to play tricks with initials, as we saw in the GOG DRM quest. Gaunt O'Dim agrees to help Geralt escape in exchange for a promise, and sure enough the ship soon hits some rocks and Geralt is able to escape. Gaunt O'Dim catches up with Geralt soon after and basically blackmails Geralt into completing 3 tasks for him. Or rather, for the other key player in all this, Olgierd von Everec. Hearts of Stone is largely the story of Olgierd. Geralt just happens to be along for the ride. As in the story of Pan Twardowski, Olgierd made a pact with the devil. As per the terms of the pact, the devil, or Gaunt O'Dim in this case, must find a proxy to complete Olgierd's 3 wishes. On completion of the wishes, O'Dim can claim Olgierd's soul, but only should they both meet on the moon. Obviously, as with Rome in Pan Twardowski, this last clause was designed to be impossible to complete. Even so, Olgierd doesn't really want Geralt to complete the 3 tasks, so he sets ones that he deems impossible. First, Geralt must acquire a particular house for Olgierd, then he must show Olgierd's brother the night of his life, and finally he must acquire a rose that Olgierd once gave to his wife. The difficulty of acquiring a house is probably self-explanatory, particularly to millennials. However, the other 2 are much tougher than they sound. Olgierd's brother is dead, so suddenly throwing a big party doesn't seem like it will be enough to fulfill the second task. And Olgierd gave that rose to his wife years ago. It's likely deader than his brother at this point. These 3 quests are massive and multi-layered, and yet overall this DLC does a much better job keeping the player focused on the end goal. In my video on the base game, I complained about how Geralt was often too far detached from what he was hoping to achieve, with one of the major examples being how he was helping a group of musicians deal with some thugs so that they would promote a play which Geralt would then use to lure out a Doppler, who in turn would impersonate a gangster who would give the order to move Dandelion to a different prison, which would give Geralt a chance to break him out, and in turn Dandelion might be able to provide a minor clue which would help Geralt with the end goal of finding Ciri. And I can't believe I've gone through all that again because it was a bloody mouthful to say the first time. The point is, in Hearts of Stone it's fairly easy to keep track of what you're doing and why. Each of Olgierd's requests is like a side quest, except much longer, and the fact that they aren't under any fake time pressure makes a lot of sense. You can relax and tackle each one separately. If there's a weak link amongst the 3, it's probably the mission to get a house, although even that one has some great moments, such as when you first go to scope out the auction house that in turn holds the house in question in its vault. Geralt gets to take part in the auction and can even snap up a bit of a bargain if he impresses the artist with his knowledge of, well, what a landscape painting is. You can also buy the glasses belonging to the professor who worked alongside Azar Javed in the first game. There's a really touching moment here when Geralt meets an old lady who happens to collect Witcher gear, and she's especially knowledgeable about the School of the Wolf. She tricks Geralt into meeting her on the balcony, at which point she explains why she collects Witcher gear. Many years ago she was romantically involved with a young Witcher from the School of the Wolf who went by the name Vesemir. They fell in love, but her father wouldn't allow the relationship and Vesemir had to run off, leaving behind part of his Witcher gear in the process. We've only ever known Vesemir as an old man, a mentor to both Geralt and Ciri, so it's great to get a glimpse of his life as a youngster and see the woman he fell in love with. Much like Geralt, Vesemir wasn't quite as emotionless as Witchers are often made out to be. The owner of the auction house won't willingly let Geralt into the vault and won't so much consider selling the house in question, but fortunately a mysterious man in black bumps into Geralt outside the auction house and invites him into a little conspiracy, namely to rob the place. Geralt needs to recruit some help and he has some flexibility on who he chooses, although not as much as the game wants you to believe because some of the possible recruits are already dead. The differences in the mission based on who you recruited are pretty inconsequential anyway. Once in the vault, Geralt is confronted by the owner of the auction house who happens to be the brother of the man leading the conspiracy. The brothers fell out over money years ago, and Geralt can now choose which one to support. In situations like this, I'd usually stick with Uold, the brother I was already working with. However, Uold had already broken Geralt's strict no-kill policy a few times, plus he lied about his motivation for this entire mission. I sided with Horst, however he wasn't grateful enough to let Geralt take the house and insists Geralt would have to kill him to get it. The value isn't so much in the house as it is the contents, namely the will of Horst's father. Taking the will would effectively bankrupt Horst, so Geralt opts to fulfill Olgierd's request to the letter by taking the house but leaving behind the documents. By twisting Olgierd's request in this way, Geralt is acting much like the devil or a djinn, but I chose not to dwell on that. Olgierd is understandably annoyed and explains that under the terms of the will, the brothers were supposed to meet every year under friendly terms. They haven't been doing that, so they should lose the estate, and under the terms of the will it would have gone to a local hospital. Not that Olgierd especially cares about the hospital, he just wanted revenge on the Bosordi brothers for buying up his own family's fortune on the cheap years ago. The second quest, to show Olgierd's brother Vladimir the night of his life, is almost entirely devoid of combat or really any conflict at all, and yet it is probably the most memorable part of the story. With Shani's help, Geralt is able to talk to Vladimir's ghost, and the ghost agrees to let Geralt show him a good time, but only if he can use Geralt's body in the process. Shani, and myself for that matter, were constantly amused by the changes in Geralt when Vladimir had possession of him. He smiles all of a sudden and there's a spring in his step. He's talkative, enthusiastic and entirely inappropriate. After hundreds of hours with grumpy Geralt, it was a lot of fun to see this new version. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't swap this Geralt for the classic one, but it makes a nice change. Shani wants Geralt to accompany her to a wedding, and Vladimir happens to love weddings. He takes control of Geralt's body and the player is simply tasked with having fun. Whether that consists of completing a quick Witcher-style contract to find a missing fire breather, playing some Gwent, insulting the groom, collecting shoes from the bottom of a pond, herding pigs, or even just dancing. There's nothing else to it. I kept expecting a royal griffin to swoop down from the skies to ruin the wedding, requiring Geralt to step in and save the day, or perhaps have him keep the guests safe from a bunch of bandits who are trying to spoil the fun. But nothing happens. In terms of combat, the closest we get to any is a fist fight after Geralt, well controlled by Vladimir, hits on a young woman with some overly protective brothers. It feels like a bit of an exaggeration to call this lack of gameplay brave, but it kind of is. The wedding can last for hours, and I'm sure if you described the experience to someone not well versed in games, or even specifically the Witcher world, it would sound like a huge waste of time. And yet it's definitely the most memorable part of the story for me. The final quest Geralt must perform for Olgierd is to return a violet rose he gifted to his wife. His wife died many years ago, however Geralt is able to summon her and follow her into a painting, which is essentially a collection of memories from their marriage. As you move through the grounds and the house, you must pick up and place items in the correct spot to recreate the memories, and then watch the slow deterioration of their marriage. This painting is all that's keeping Iris in this world, and usually Geralt releases spirits trapped in these sorts of places, although usually those spirits either want to be released or are causing harm to those around them. Iris does not want to go, and she's not doing any harm. She wants to keep her connection to this world no matter how flimsy it may be. Geralt can sever the connection and take the rose he needs to complete the task, or he can let her stay here, in which case she gives him a painting of the rose instead. If you do the latter, Olgierd is a bit miffed at having been tricked again, but he really should learn to word these things more carefully, as he's about to find out. Once Geralt has completed his tasks, Gauntro Dim tells him to bring Olgierd to a specific meeting spot. However, before doing that, Shani tells Geralt of a man who is well versed in black magic and might be able to help. Geralt finds this Professor Shakeslock, who it turns out made his own deal with Gaunter. Shakeslock wanted complete physical protection, and Gauntro Dim was only too happy to provide that, within a very small circle. If Shakeslock steps out of the circle, he dies, as Geralt soon sees, but not before Shakeslock tells Geralt that the key to defeating Gauntro Dim is to use his desire to gamble for souls against him. Gaunter can't resist a soul and will always want to take that bet. The only remarkable thing about this is that Geralt had to go through a separate optional quest to figure this out. It seemed pretty obvious. Geralt brings Olgierd to the designated meeting spot and Gauntro Dim reveals his trick. They are in fact meeting on the moon.
You forget. The pact states you can take it only once you've fulfilled 3 wishes and...
And we stand together on the moon. Well, what do you know?
The bargain is complete and Gaunter can claim Olgierd's soul, unless Geralt steps in and makes another deal. Geralt will play a game for Olgierd to keep his soul. Fail to complete the game, which consists of solving a riddle, and Geralt will also lose his soul alongside Olgierd. I'm going to talk about Olgierd a little more soon, but suffice it to say that there is no good reason for Geralt to take this risk, although in the spirit of video games, I of course pushed him in that direction. The riddle is pretty straightforward. The game wants you to think the answer is a mirror, but it's clearly a reflection because of the line that states "no blow can cause me harm." You have to pretend to fall for the trick initially because you can't get out of this first area until you find a mirror, at which point you move into this new zone, create a pool of water, and Bob's your uncle, you have a reflection. Gaunter O'Dim is dead, or as dead as the devil ever is, and Olgierd lives to fight another day. I think even that fairly dry description of events is enough to show why I like Hearts of Stone. We put together a team and broke into a safe under an auction house, messed around at a wedding while possessed by a ghost, and explored a painted world while being guided around by a demon cat and dog. That's not bad for some added content. However, the reason I love Hearts of Stone is the way these quests bring out Olgierd's backstory. A story of love, financial ruin, betrayal and redemption before a slow descent into hopelessness. It's amazing just how compelling the story of a heartless character can be. Olgierd was from a rich and noble family, although he and his brother behaved more like glorified bandits much of the time. He fell in love with a beautiful young woman called Iris. However, once he lost his fortune, Iris's family withdrew support for the match and tried to marry her off to an Etheri prince instead. Olgierd wasn't best pleased and accidentally cursed the prince, turning him into the frog that Geralt killed in the first mission. Ironically, Olgierd lying to Geralt about the toad was what set his downfall in motion. Killing the toad led to Geralt's arrest, which in turn led to him being freed by and then indebted to Gaunter O'Dim, who was looking for a proxy to fulfill 3 impossible wishes. If Olgierd had been honest with Geralt, none of this would have happened. Olgierd then researched dark magic and was able to contact Gaunter O'Dim, who agreed to grant 3 wishes, but only if Olgierd sacrificed either Iris or his brother. Olgierd chose his brother, and this information completely reframes that entire wedding quest. During that quest, Vladimir spoke highly of Olgierd and appreciated how his brother spun a heroic tale to explain his death. Of course, now we know Olgierd did this out of guilt, not love. This guilt is also why one of his wishes was to show Vladimir the time of his life. I'm a little confused about the next part because Olgierd seemingly wishes for his fortune back and for immortality, however those don't seem to count towards the 3 wishes. Maybe Gaunter O'Dim gave out a couple of free samples to get Olgierd hooked. With his fortune back, Olgierd can now marry Iris. However, his immortality makes his heart slowly turn to stone, and the marriage suffers as a result. The marriage becomes loveless, and Olgierd's attempts to fix things through gifts of a cat and a dog, and even a caretaker to help look after the house, aren't enough to turn things around. Iris's father tries to dissolve the union on the basis that Olgierd isn't the same man Iris married. I'm not 100% how that logic would stand up in court, but it doesn't matter because Olgierd kills Iris's father in a fit of rage, and any hope he might have had of fixing things is now long gone. Gaunter O'Dim remains a bit of a mystery. He has the power to control time, and I doubt he's actually the devil, just an evil figure as such. One cool touch is that Geralt actually met Gaunter back at the very beginning of the base game. He pretended to be a merchant and told Geralt that he saw Yennefer head to a Nilfgaardian garrison. The conversation ended with the mysterious man mentioning that perhaps Geralt will one day be able to return the favour. It's a nice little touch. So yeah, I loved this story. First of all, it's typical CD Projekt Red storytelling, and that there's lots of dodgy characters where even those you like in spite of themselves. There's no happy ending, and of course it's based on an existing folktale. I also liked how Geralt came into this folk story retelling a lot earlier than he usually does. Typically, Geralt doesn't get involved until near the end, when most of the events have already happened, and he just needs to banish a wraith to put an end to it. Think of the Tower Full of Mice quest in the base game where we find out what happened via flashbacks, and all we really do is fight a wraith. Even though there is a lot of backstory around Olgierd, and we do again find that out through viewing old memories, Geralt plays a much bigger role in events. He's the one fulfilling the wishes, and the way he tricks Olgierd is similar to the devil's style of wish fulfillment. When it comes to the story, I only have one complaint of note, and it's a slightly strange one. It's also even more subjective than this sort of criticism already is. I guess I wish this story hadn't been told through a video game, or at least not this type of video game. While there isn't a lot of action in terms of combat, the player does often need to take control for minor actions like moving from one conversation to another at the wedding, swimming to the bottom of a pond, or picking up items in memories and putting them in slightly different places. Nothing that ever qualifies as a puzzle or challenge of any kind. And because the story and writing is so engrossing, I actually slightly resented the times I had to sit back up and take control for some minor exercise. The Telltale games often did this. They would make you move around a small room to examine items on the pretext of it being gameplay, when frankly it would have been just as easy to have the player select items from a list. Events here were so engrossing and well told that I wanted to stay slouched back in my chair watching the story unfold in front of me with minimal effort, and I slightly resented having to pick up slippers from the bottom of the pond. CD Projekt Red took a huge risk creating such a story-heavy piece of DLC, and yet I wish it went a bit further and abandoned the little pretenses of gameplay during otherwise relaxing moments at the wedding or while wandering through the painting. I suspect there was a rule in place which stated that the player could not go longer than a set amount of time, say 15 minutes, without being in control of Geralt, which is a shame because all those short chores do is serve to take you out of the moment, not further immerse you in it. The writing in Hearts of Stone is good enough to be a book without any interactive elements. Clearly CD Projekt Red put all its effort into the story because it didn't change a lot else from the base game. I like how we get to spend a lot of time in Oxenfurt because this city is a huge part of the books, and yet I didn't spend that much time in it in the base game. However, there's no new region to visit, which I wouldn't have minded were it not for the huge tease at the start where it looks like Geralt is going to be transported to a new area with a completely new culture, not to mention shock horror non-white people, when the ship ends up dumping you into an existing region. As discussed in the last video, CD Projekt Red strongly bases its races here on our own world, and as such the Ophiri are a Middle Eastern culture. Persia in particular comes to mind, although we don't see enough of them to be overly specific. I'm not sure how this will sit with those who passionately feel that the fictional people who use magic, do deals with devils, speak to spirits and change mice into horses should always be white for fear of not respecting Polish folklore. I'm pretty sure Pan Twardowski never met Persian people, so this inclusion here is presumably incredibly offensive to someone for reasons. After the shipwreck, our only major way to interact with the Ophiri is through a small group of vendors, which is a shame because they add a new twist to the combat, if the one fight we do have is anything to go by. After the shipwreck, Geralt has to fight his captors, and while at first I assumed it was going to be a standard fight against a bunch of glorified bandits, I was pleased to find that there was a mage amongst them who wreaked absolute havoc. I had to prioritise him immediately, and for the first time I found myself approaching a combat situation much like I would in an old school CRPG. I was weighing up which was the better option of trying to kill the mage while 10 other swords swing at you, or deal with the swords first and take damage from spells. It's a little finicky, mind you. As discussed in the video for the base game, the combat system here isn't exactly conducive to moving around quickly and targeting specific enemies. You have to make your way over to the mage with these awkward rolls and dodges and then hope the game lets you target him. This one moves around a lot as well, so the fight just looks terrible. I don't want to repeat all my existing combat criticisms from the base game, so I'll just settle for saying that combat still has issues around who Geralt attacks and when, plus enemies walking away from battle and that kind of thing. The main contribution Ophiri make is the new rune enchantment system. Unfortunately, you need a lot of money to get this guy the tools he needs, and he constantly asks for more to upgrade his equipment. Just when you've handed over what you assume is the last payment, he finds an excuse for an even bigger sum next time. He's basically Tom Nook. The upgrades he offers are decent enough. You can make enemies explode on death after using Igni, and increase the range of your swords. The best enchantment is probably the ability to make any armour type be treated as light armour. This is a big deal if you're using one of the heavy armour sets and you want the additional protection they provide without the loss of stamina regeneration. I didn't acquire any of the enchantments. None were necessary even on Death March, and for the first time since starting the game, I simply didn't have enough money or know of any ways to get the amount I needed. For one of the payments, I decided the best way to raise funds would be to sell all the runes I'd been collecting for the previous 100 plus hours. They'd been sitting in my inventory doing nothing, and I sold them for a fortune. Turns out though, the guy who specialises in enchanting runes needs low level runes as a form of crafting material. Who could have guessed? Anyway, compared to the new upgrade system in Blood and Wine, the rune enchantment is mediocre and probably not worth the money. In fact, given how Blood and Wine has a few money drains of its own, I recommend you ignore this guy and save up for what comes later. There are only 3 major new monster types, although they do have completely different mechanics to anything in the main game. The toad you face early on reminds me of that one in Neo, which jumps around a lot and flicks out its tongue to deal a lot of damage. Fortunately for Geralt, the toad also has a poison attack which heals Geralt if he has leveled up the Golden Oriole potion. I discussed this in the Witcher 3 video, so I won't bang on about it, just to say that it's an even bigger problem in the DLC because so many of the enemies use poison attacks. While in the Painted World, Geralt has to fight the Caretaker, who is slightly closer to the enemies you might find in a Neo or From Software type game. His attacks are fairly easy to avoid, they couldn't be telegraphed much more obviously. However, his ability to heal from both the minions he summons and any damage he deals to Geralt means there is some pressure to get in as many hits as possible whenever he's open. It's still a fairly comfortable fight though. The boss battles against the Toad and the Caretaker represent a slight twist on a problem from the base game. In my video on The Witcher 3 I complained about how the big fights were often against monsters we'd already fought, except with bigger health bars. That meant the bestiary already contained all the information we needed on strengths and weaknesses, and the monster contracts came down to finding the monster, not understanding it. In Hearts of Stone, the Toad and the Caretaker are completely new monster types which we can't practice against beforehand, which is great. However, we also can't learn their strengths or weaknesses before the fight, no matter how thoroughly we investigate. You can check every body in the sewer, it won't help you much. I desperately want a return to monsters being things we should research first before fighting, instead of just following dead bodies or strange smells. The other new monster type is basically a spider. They are minion level enemies but dangerous ones and a great addition to the bestiary. These spiders are fast, they have melee and ranged attacks, and they attack intelligently. They generally wait to attack in groups and will run away if you try to take them on one by one. They shoot webbing from a distance which locks Geralt in place, giving them an opportunity to run in and attack as a group. Fighting a group of spiders early in this DLC felt like a difficulty spike of sorts, and it was the first time I've been properly challenged in tens of hours. The Hearts of Stone DLC screams quality over quantity, which for all its brilliance was not something you could say about the base game. There's little in the way of side quests, monster contracts or treasure hunts. You can stumble upon some high level bandit camps and the like, but that's about it. Of course, if you're playing Hearts of Stone, you're still in the map for the base game, which means all that filler content you probably haven't completed yet is still there if you want it. That is not the case with The Witcher 3's second piece of DLC, Blood and Wine. It feels somewhat ridiculous to describe Blood and Wine as a second piece of DLC. CD Projekt Red could easily have sold Blood and Wine as the only piece of DLC without Hearts of Stone, and it would have still been great value. In fact, if CD Projekt Red were run like Ubisoft or Bethesda, it would have been released separately for $30 or $40 like Far Cry New Dawn or Wolfenstein Twin Sisters or whatever the hell that thing was called. Blood and Wine has a new map, which is more than Far Cry New Dawn, come to think of it. Plus more enemies, an expanded skill tree, loads of new side quests, monster contracts and treasure hunts, plus you can even dye your gear a different colour. In other words, it's more of what you probably already loved. Except in many ways it's better. The Witcher 3 was rightly criticised for having a messy open world map and too many random check marks and question marks. It's a problem games have had for probably over a decade at this point. And yet, as we'll see, with regards to open world clutter, CD Projekt Red makes more progress in the 12 months between releasing the base game and this expansion than most developers have made in a decade. Of course, as with Hearts of Stone, it's the story that stands out, although this time not for entirely positive reasons. Blood and Wine's story of Geralt teaming up with an old friend to track down a mass murderer in the new region of Toussaint is a hell of a lot of fun, but like many fun stories you do have to switch your brain off a few times to properly enjoy it. Whereas I'd describe Hearts of Stone as a masterpiece of video game storytelling that rewards a deep dive into journals and backstories, Blood and Wine is an entertaining blockbuster of a story that you're best off not dwelling on too much. Geralt is hired by Queen Anna Henrietta of Toussaint to hunt down what is being called the Beast, who has just claimed his third victim in the otherwise beautiful and peaceful region. Geralt and the Queen originally met in the books. Queen Anna had an affair with Dandelion years ago while her husband was out of town. Dandelion returned to Toussaint with Geralt after the Duke had died and resumed his relationship with Queen Anna until his wandering eye took over and he cheated on her with someone else. You probably shouldn't cheat on a monarch, and sure enough Queen Anna soon ordered his execution, although fortunately for Dandelion she had to change her heart at the last minute. Queen Anna isn't the most notable inclusion from the books though. Blood and Wine stars one of my favourite book characters, Regis the Vampire. Regis was a long-standing member of Geralt's crew and a great character. He's a vampire who's been around for centuries and has the wisdom that comes with age. He's given up blood, so he's not a danger, although he still struggles with the addiction, in the same way an alcoholic has to fight a desire for booze. Vampires are largely immortal, but in the books, Regis seems to die a fairly permanent death at Steiger Castle, when he saves Geralt and Yennefer from Vilgefortz and is essentially melted in the process. Another vampire called Detlef found Regis, or whatever was left of him, and somehow, slowly and painfully by the sounds of it, brought Regis back to life at the expense of his own health. Detlef just so happens to be the beast that Geralt is hunting. Regis is absolutely convinced that the man who has at this point brutally murdered 4 seemingly innocent people in cold blood is worth talking to instead of killing, and that he must have had a good reason for what he's done. Regis is convinced Detlef can be redeemed, although it's fairly clear Regis feels that he owes this man a debt and this is how he plans to repay it. Regis and Geralt hunt down Detlef together and discover that he is being blackmailed. Someone has captured his lover, Syanna, and is threatening to kill her unless Detlef plays the role of assassin. I suppose this mitigates his guilt ever so slightly, and the focus then shifts to finding the blackmailer through some fairly tenuous links, like spilt wine on a document, which a sommelier is able to identify down to the year, which turns out to be a rare wine that is supposed to be exclusively for the palace. It's one of those quests that relies on so many coincidences your head starts to hurt if you think about it too much. Detlef's lover turns out to be none other than the Queen's banished sister who is trapped at Duntine Castle. Although, as Geralt points out, it doesn't exactly look like she's being held prisoner. Because she's not. Syanna is also the blackmailer. She's been using Detlef to get revenge on those who mistreated her in the past and on her sister for forgetting about her after she was thrown out of the royal palace and left for dead. I'll discuss Syanna a bit more later because her motivations do end up getting fleshed out a bit, but that doesn't help this scene much because this is where we derail the entire story. After rescuing/finding Syanna, Geralt tells Detlef that Syanna tricked him, using his love for her to accomplish her goals. He's understandably furious and you expect him to demand an explanation or even kill her in anger. He's not exactly the calm and reasoned sort. So what does he do? Detlef tells Syanna to meet him in 3 days to explain what's going on or else he will destroy the city. I don't entirely understand his reaction here. He's initially angry but then decides it's a good idea to let Syanna have 3 days to come up with some excuses for what she's done. That's just not sensible. Regis explains it as Detlef giving himself time to cool off, but that doesn't mean he has to be stupid about it. He could have taken Syanna away with him while he cooled down. If you're anything like me, you probably think you know why this scene is playing out in this way, and it might even make you feel a little smug. This is a video game, and therefore this moment was written in this way to give us a chance to complete quests before deciding what to do about that 3-day time limit. The player is being given some agency and control. And then you immediately feel stupid because that 3-day period Detlef gave Syanna before destroying the city just disappears in a time skip in the next scene. So what was the point in giving us 3 days? Nothing happened. We go straight from the threat to the city being attacked. It might as well have happened simultaneously. Because I am utterly incapable of admitting I'm wrong, I'm going to claim there is cut content that would have taken place between these 2 scenes. I am so certain of this that I wouldn't change my mind if I heard the developers say otherwise in interviews. Short of seeing footage of every single planning meeting, I won't be convinced otherwise, and even then I'd suspect the footage had been doctored. There's clearly something missing. I'd wager there was a choice. Depending on exactly what Geralt and Regis do after finding Syanna, they would either give her up and take her to Detlef, or agree to protect her and let Detlef attack the city. The developers then went ahead and produced the attack on the city and realised that, well, 1, it looks absolutely incredible, and 2, it was very expensive to make. I'm guessing that once this battle was in place, no one at CD Projekt Red wanted players to miss out on it, and fair enough. So they effectively made it unmissable, which in turn meant whatever was planned for that 3-day period had to be thrown out. That is most likely what happened, but I suppose another possibility is that the Queen imprisons Syanna for her crimes and Detlef attacks the city to get her back because he doesn't know what she's done yet. This would explain how rushed and out of place the scene where they met was, not to mention a few scenes near the end that don't quite fit. For example, there's this weird bit with a ribbon that Syanna wears which somehow protects her from an attack, which feels completely out of left field. You now have 2 choices to track down Detlef. If you believe Detlef is beyond saving, you can go find a woman we met earlier called Oriana, who also happens to be a vampire. She helps you track down one of the greater vampires who can force Detlef out of hiding. In the process, you discover that the orphanage Oriana runs isn't quite the charitable project she makes it out to be, and is actually a blood farm of sorts. I wasn't feeling especially sympathetic towards Dettlaff. However, Regis is a friend, so I decided to play nice one more time by bringing Syanna to Dettlaff, which in turn required finding where Queen Anna had hidden her. Somehow Syanna had been shoved into a fairy tale world, which as prisons go isn't terrible. When it comes to the fairy tale element, there's none of the subtlety of Hearts of Stone here. You stumble upon Goldilocks and the three bears, the three little pigs, and even Rapunzel, who is called Longlocks here, presumably for copyright reasons. What this region lacks in subtlety, it makes up for in awe-inspiring moments like the gorgeous view, or the scene where you reach the top of the tower, only to find Longlocks hanging by her hair, having given up all hope of her prince ever coming to rescue her. Geralt does eventually track down Dettlaff, and at this point it is clear there's no stopping him. Regis tries, but Dettlaff is too powerful, and frankly gave me a run for my money as well. Geralt does eventually win the fight, but as we saw with Regis, vampires are not easily killed. They can only be permanently destroyed by another vampire, so Regis has to step in and do the deed himself. It's a tough moment. Even though I think he was naive, you could tell Regis really did want to help Dettlaff, and he considers it a personal failing that he was unable to turn him around. The story is not yet over. Regis convinces Geralt to investigate the possibility that there was one more planned victim, and of course, it's the Queen. This part is optional, but if you do work this out, you can convince Syanna not to go through with murdering the Queen when they meet later on. I appreciated the epilogue here because it gave us more time with Regis, and I think the story earned an extra hour on the end. However, the fact that the planned victim was the Queen was really anticlimactic. Of course Syanna wanted to kill the Queen. Even if the Queen hadn't originally been on the list, everyone should have been on high alert for an attack, given that we know Syanna hates the Queen with a passion. I'd have preferred a minor twist here, like finding out someone else was working with Syanna the whole time, and that person tries to kill Syanna to cover their tracks. Or perhaps there's a fifth planned victim who was instrumental in banishing Syanna in the first place. The Queen is just far too obvious a victim, and not an interesting way to wrap up the murder story. There's a lovely conversation with Regis at the end, where both men drink and question each other about what's happened since they last saw each other. This conversation cemented a feeling I touched on in the main video, which is that Dandelion didn't get treated all that well in this trilogy. Regis is only in one piece of DLC, and yet their time together is so well handled that this feels like the strongest relationship Geralt has with any other man in the games. It probably helps that Regis is simply a more fascinating character. As one of the only vampires we spend significant time with, he is the source of information on an entire race, and he's lived for hundreds of years. Vampires are clearly far superior to humans. They even have books on the best way to raise humans as cattle and how to prepare them as food. Regis provides a window into an interesting culture. Dandelion serves more as a source of humour and levity. The game ends with Yennefer showing up at Geralt's vineyard, where they agree to settle down and spend a peaceful life together, as hinted at in the end credits for the base game. For the expansion to tie back into that ending is a lovely touch, and I absolutely do not care how cosy and straightforward this ending is. Geralt has earned it, CD Projekt Red has earned it, and hell, I feel like I've earned it at this point. I discussed a few issues with the story while going through that summary, and while I think there are some plot holes that detract from the experience, I'd say the main issue is with the two characters who are supposed to carry the story, Dettlaff and Syanna. As with Hearts of Stone, this isn't really Geralt's story, it's the story of Dettlaff and Syanna, and they are not good characters. Let's start with Syanna. If we travel through fairy tale land with her, she gradually spills the beans about why she decided to go on a murderous rampage, using Dettlaff as a tool. She was born during a solar eclipse, and when she later began to suffer from nightmares, rumours started to spread that she was afflicted by the curse of the Black Sun. Syanna and her sister would occasionally fight and get into trouble, as siblings do, and according to Syanna at least, people would often take Anna's side, believing every bad thing Syanna did to be the result of the curse. The curse of the Black Sun is the same curse that afflicted Renfrey in the short story known as The Lesser Evil, which you may be familiar with if you've watched the Netflix television show. The book in particular handles this story much better, and goes more into the nature versus nurture argument that is only really hinted at here. Eventually, Syanna was accused of enough minor offences that she was banished from her kingdom. 4 soldiers were charged with escorting her out of Toussaint, and they all abused her before leaving her for dead in the middle of nowhere. These 4 soldiers then become her victims. Despite this, I didn't find her all that sympathetic. I certainly understand why she would be angry at those charged with escorting her out of Toussaint, but why isn't she annoyed with anyone who ordered it? I'm sure some of them are still alive. I'm also not convinced of her hatred of her sister. The Queen was a young girl when Syanna was kicked out, and they got on well enough as kids. She feels like her sister should have done more to go out and find her once she became queen, but it's a weak excuse for murder. And then there's her ending. Given how long this supposed hatred of the Queen has built up and how long her plan took to execute, it's incredibly easy for Geralt to convince her not to kill the Queen after all. This is supposed to be a redemption of a great villain, but it feels empty and way too easy. She didn't overcome anything. She just changed her mind while sitting by the window. What happens to her now? I assume she will be kept locked up for the rest of her life, although given how she's the Queen's sister, I'm guessing it will be a comfortable imprisonment. This is why when bad guys get redeemed, they also tend to get killed off. It's just simpler that way. Think of Darth Vader and Kylo Ren. If they didn't die, what would you do with them? Are they forgiven for the billions of people they killed just because they had a change of heart? This is why it might have been better for there to be another secret individual involved, and that person could either kill Syanna or attempt to kill the Queen, and Syanna could step in the way and sacrifice her life for her sisters. It's a little neater that way, and means Syanna sacrifices something for her redemption. As for Detlef, he's even less compelling. He's basically just an incredibly immature and angry teenager. Imagine the type of person who writes an angry YouTube comment in response to someone saying maybe a game would be a bit better if not everyone was white, and you probably have an idea of what he's like. Even though Regis tells us Detlef is on the passionate end of the spectrum, it still doesn't add up with what we know about his past actions. For one thing, I can't imagine an immortal being like a vampire being this immature. He must have seen countless generations be born, grow up, grow old, and then die. Would he really fall in love like a horny teenager? When Regis talks about Detlef bringing him back to life, he makes Detlef sound like a patient and intelligent being. That is not who we end up seeing. The one Detlef moment I really liked involved one of the murders he committed before Geralt was on the case. There's a moment where Detlef is queuing to have his shoes shined and some noble pushes in front. Another guy lets Detlef take his place. A small gesture that really touches Detlef, and the two end up becoming friends. That is until Detlef is instructed to murder him. He goes ahead and does it, but is so upset and angry afterwards that he cuts off his own hand in frustration. I needed more moments like this to really care about Detlef or sympathise with him. There are a few other minor story mishaps as well, like the borderline hilarious moment when Regis shows up with Detlef when Geralt is having dinner with the Queen. Geralt is rightly furious that Regis brought Detlef here, but he then goes off alone with Regis to tell him this, and leaves Detlef, the mass murderer, alone with the Queen. Okay, there's another vampire there, but Geralt doesn't know that. It's a shame the story flails about in the second half, because it started strong and is otherwise enjoyable. Apart from a pointless quest running around with the Queen early on, it's pretty well paced, with each mission pushing things forward, so you never feel like you're treading water. Hanging out with Regis and finding out what he's been up to, plus information about vampires generally, is a lot of fun. Plus the main story has one of the best quests in the game. Le Cargo Faux, I think that's how it's pronounced, has two spectacular moments. The first is when Geralt needs to obtain some saliva from a wight because Regis needs it for a potion. The wight is a cursed woman. You can kill her and get the saliva that way, or you can try to cure the curse, which of course was the option I went for. The curse states, quote, "None shall sit and dine with you at your table. No spoon you have shall sate you. Never again shall you wish to spy your reflection in the mirror." Close quote. The wight has spent decades trying to find a spoon it can use to eat, but as the curse states, no spoon will satiate its hunger. To break the curse, Geralt has to willingly share a meal with the wight, and they have to eat without using a spoon. The reference to spoons in the curse probably means the person who cursed her in the first place was our good friend Gaunter O'Dim. We saw him with spoons a couple of times in Hearts of Stone, and knowing CD Projekt Red, this isn't a coincidence. The next ingredient Regis needs from the potion is vampire blood, but not just any vampire blood. It must be the blood of a vampire who is mad with bloodlust. Regis insists on locking himself in a cage suspended in the air, while Geralt slaughters beasts below him to drive Regis insane. It's a powerful moment showing just how far Regis is prepared to go to help his friend Detlef. Another cool touch in that quest is how you can invite the old woman who recovered from the curse to stay with you in a vineyard that the Queen just casually gave Geralt as a down payment for finding the beast. The house side quest isn't much of a quest as such. You just need to keep giving money to your caretaker and he'll upgrade the place. It's not all that interesting and the upgrades don't change much. When you first take ownership, the building is showing signs of age and the grounds are a little messy, but I mean it's still a glorious place. It's a working vineyard with a full staff, and frankly it's a little overwhelming for a traveller like Geralt, who is used to sleeping on the ground under a tree if he's lucky. You can hang paintings on the wall, likewise with swords, and hang up full suits of armour. Some improvements undoubtedly make the home nicer inside, but that's about all that felt worth the money. You can hire blacksmiths and armourers to work in the grounds, but at this point you're going to be relying largely on the Grand Master Armourer for your new gear needs. Inside the house you can create more space for swords and armour, but I didn't have a lot of spare gear anyway because I was selling it all to get the money to upgrade the house. It's nice to have more space, but I would have preferred to start with a really small house and gardens and expand the size and recruit staff with all the money I was spending. Outside of the house quest, I enjoyed nearly everything Blood and Wine had to offer in terms of side quests, and especially appreciated the efforts to turn boring checklist tasks into something a little more interesting. The Wine Wars quest sees Geralt in the middle of a dispute between two locals who want to take over a profitable vineyard, and they both claim that the other is trying to sabotage them to make them look bad, with the sabotage mainly taking the form of giant centipedes or arch spores on the land that Geralt needs to destroy. Unsurprisingly, there's a third party involved, and the two of them end up putting their differences to one side and working together. Each of the areas Geralt needs to clear of monsters is actually an abandoned village, which in the base game would have just been another marker on the map that you could easily ignore. It was busy work essentially, but this quest kind of changes that. Now sure, the end result here is still a quest that tells you to go to a bunch of different places, kill monsters or find a thing and then report back when complete. However, context is so important and can completely change how you perceive a task. In terms of what the player needs to do, there's often not a lot of difference between a good story quest and a low effort fetch quest or kill all the monsters quest. You often are going to a place and killing things. The reason this sometimes feels like a chore is a lack of context or effort put into motivating the player to go and do the work. The minimal amount of story in the Wine Wars quest was enough for me to want to complete all the abandoned locations, whereas in the base game I didn't bother. There are other examples of this, such as the Lebio the Statue quest, which has Geralt saving a bunch of architects from monsters and bandits, or just waking them up after a night of heavy drinking. And your reward is watching the gradual construction of a huge statue which can be seen from miles away. Mind you, there is a limit on how well this can work. For example, Geralt is tasked with completing 15 challenges such as liberating large bases or rescuing knights. However, just giving the player a list of 15 things to do without story context is too much. The Wine Wars quest had about the same number of missions, but because it was split into 3 smaller groups with bits of story dripped out in stages, I had much more motivation to complete it. Of course, Blood and Wine still has the huge side quests that CD Projekt Red is fast becoming known for. The most notable was probably the Warble of a Smitten Knight, which sees Geralt enter the tournament in the place of an injured knight, Guillaume I think, who was looking for a way to get closer to one of the tournament organisers, Vivian, who he's in love with and believes to be cursed. There are 3 stages in the tournament, at which point a winner is declared and they then face the reigning champion. The first stage is archery, the second horse racing, and the third is a big sword fight. The archery was easy enough, as was the big fight, but the horse race was a complete mess. It's actually not so much a race as like a time trial mode from an old arcade racing game. To extend the timer, Geralt must either hit targets with his crossbow or knock over dummies with a swing of his sword. The targets are easy enough to hit, but using the sword is a complete nightmare. I didn't engage in a lot of sword combat while on horseback during the game, however it's usually pretty generous. You hit the attack button and the game automatically does most of the work. Not so during this contest. There's a huge delay now between hitting the button and actually attacking, and hitting the dummy seems to require an ungodly amount of precision, with most of my swings being deemed to just go right through. Sunken cost fallacy took over, so after I missed a few swings I found myself basically stopping the horse just to get the hit in because I was annoyed. Anyway, I made a complete mess of this event, and even though I aced the other 2, it wasn't enough to win the tournament. Geralt's investigation leads him to a clearing in the woods where he uncovers that Vivian is under a curse that turns her into a half human, half bird. The change is happening more and more often and it's destroying her life. Geralt knows of 2 solutions. The first is to put the curse on someone else, but Vivian refuses to let anyone suffer the way she has. The other option is to draw out the curse with an egg, which will heal her but could mean she only has 7 years left to live. Vivian is delighted at the chance to have 7 great years instead of an unknown number of miserable ones, so she snaps up the offer. My favourite part of this quest is how Vivian rejects Guillaume once it's all over. The knight is in love with Vivian and he recruited Geralt to save her, but of course that doesn't mean she has to settle down and marry him as some sort of reward. Toussaint definitely has some weird issues around chivalry and relationships, and men have a rougher time of things than normal. Men slaying powerful beasts almost seems like a rite of passage before they can hook up with a woman. During the tournament, you are challenged to a duel by none other than Ansaze, son of Queen Meve of Lyria and Rivia. This is not the same son of Meve who features prominently in Thronebreaker. Ansaze is pissed at Geralt for abandoning Queen Meve at Yaruga, and believes that by beating Geralt he would bring honour to his family or something. The fight is on horseback and has all the same problems as the horse race did earlier. It's a complete disaster, and would have been better as a more traditional sword fight or fist fight. Interestingly, Geralt can choose to enter the tournament under a different name, Ravix of Thorthorn, which was the name he used when first meeting Queen Calanthe. If you do this, Ansaze never challenges Geralt because he doesn't know who he is. I love how the game accounts for things like this, but as with the main game, it's a little inconsistent. For example, some guards stated they were working for King Radovid, who was long since dead in my playthrough, and then just a few minutes later Radovid's death was accounted for in a different conversation. More than ever I could tell Geralt's dialogue choices were utterly fake. I don't take huge issue with this so long as the NPC responses are carefully crafted in a way you don't notice, but you kind of can here, such as when I opted to keep Vivian secret but she acted like I hadn't. CD Projekt Red continues to pull no punches when it comes to hitting you directly in the feels. There's a quest in Blood and Wine that reminded me a lot of a Black Pearl from the base game. Geralt meets an eccentric, rich guy who seems to have more money than sense. He wants Geralt to accompany him on a photography expedition with his fancy new headgear. He gets some good pictures and even gives you one to hang on your wall. At the end of the quest you find out why he risks his life to get these images. His daughter is disabled and can't go outside. This is her dad's way of bringing the outside world to her. It's pretty sweet really. There are then more minor twists on expectations, such as when you meet a man in a cave who claims to have been betrayed by his brothers. As you go to leave the cave, it looks like his brothers are waiting ready to fight alongside a bunch of mercenaries. You can ambush them and fight if you like, however if you go out and talk to them you find that the brothers want to apologise, and the mercenaries aren't mercenaries at all, they're local townsfolk who heard the commotion and wanted to help. Blood and Wine also contains a lot of funny side quests, which are easily identifiable by the excellent names, such as Goodness Gracious Great Balls of Granite, which sees Geralt on the hunt for some lucky testicles that were stolen from a statue. Or there's the Painter who insists on painting Geralt half naked no matter how you actually posed. The Paper Chase quest has Geralt running around dealing with the overly bureaucratic nature of a bank, which definitely drew a few wry smiles. The problem with quests designed to satire tedium is that they are often tedious themselves, and West of Loathing had a similar quest that was both funnier and less tedious. Anyway, the stakes are often slightly lower in DLC, and this means the developers can go a little more wild than usual with the side stories, and you definitely feel like they had some fun with them here. Another great example of what sets CD Projekt Red apart from so many other developers is how the new mutations are introduced. Obviously it's fairly common to add new skills with DLC, or perhaps raise the level cap, but typically there isn't a lot of fanfare around it. If it's an Ubisoft game you might get a pop-up or 10 telling you about the new features when you boot up the game, but that's about it. Not so here. Blood and Wine adds mutations through an entire quest line, and one with quite a sad story to boot. Geralt uncovers a lair belonging to Professor Moreau, a scientist presumably named after the one from the H.G. Wells novel with a similar premise around altering genes, who is determined to reverse the mutations that turn people into witchers. His son is a witcher and he sees the mutations as an illness that needs to be cured. Through a series of memory crystals we see that his work was not successful. His son tried the cure but all it did was enhance the existing witcher mutations, not remove them. Geralt decides this might be quite useful so he gives it a go. You can only have one mutation active at any time and they are moderately expensive, requiring 2 or 3 skill points each, plus some greater mutagens to unlock them, and some of the mutations are locked behind others. You may have to spend a lot of skill points here to get the one you're after, although I got lucky because Euphoria is far and away the best mutation for an alchemy build like mine. It increases damage dealt by 0.75% for each point of toxicity, so I was doing triple damage at one point. There aren't strictly any other changes to combat. However, the DLC story quests give you a lot of XP, which means in turn you'll acquire a lot more skill points and have a chance to unlock some of the more spectacular moves that you likely didn't reach in the base game. I wasn't bothering all that much with the combat part of the skill tree, but I did mess around with the whirl ability for a bit, and it was the first time combat felt different in over 100 hours. I'm not entirely convinced these later combat options make things better as such, but they at least provide a change of pace. And after 100 hours it can be nice to pull off moves that are silly but spectacular. It reminds me a bit of the new Assassin's Creed games where they transition from relatively normal feeling combat to suddenly teleporting over to enemies or controlling arrows as they fly. Realism is abandoned and it's all a bit silly, but silly can be fun when you're playing for over 100 hours. Speaking of Assassin's Creed, there's a lovely leap of faith homage in Blood and Wine. Blood and Wine introduces more new monster types than Hearts of Stone did, however I wasn't especially impressed with the selection. There's a great fight against a Goliath near the start who you can kill with one crossbow bolt to the eye, a battle with a Shaelmar in a grand arena, and a great contest against a witch in the fairy tale world. But far too many of the new monster types aren't really new monsters at all. They're existing monsters with new names. Scurvers are just rot fiends except spikes shoot out when they explode on death, which does do a lot of damage even if it isn't inherently all that different to the regular rot fiend explosion. Spriggans are just Leshens, Slizzards are wyverns that can breathe fire, etc. So long as you're vaguely capable of recognising the monster type, you can just copy over all the strengths and weaknesses. I did like the return of Archspores and Kikimors from Witcher 1, although they contribute to the problem I mentioned in the Hearts of Stone DLC, which is the over-reliance on poison damage. The Archspores were quite challenging when I first fought them. They are a lot like the spiders in that they do a lot of melee damage and have projectile attacks to throw at you if you try to back away to heal. The projectile attack is red, so I assumed it was blood or something equally gross that I didn't have protection against. However, it's actually poison. Once I realised this, I popped Golden Oriole and let the plants heal me whenever I was low on health. I actually found myself having to break the habit of trying to dodge these attacks. Fortunately, Blood and Wine has some of the toughest fights in the game to counter this, such as that final boss battle with Dettlaff. He's incredibly fast in the first stage, and the only reliable way to do good damage is to parry attacks and get encounters. However, his speed and attack patterns make it hard to master the timing. The second phase of the fight felt nigh on impossible at first. I was convinced I was doing something wrong here, and I'm going to pass some of the blame onto the game because, well, why not? His aerial attack where he swoops down is easy to avoid once you realise he always feints and makes a second attempt. And the ground is clearly marked up when he tries to pin you in place with these tentacle things. However, the attack where he throws a bunch of bats at you is a nightmare and can deal 80% plus damage even with Quen active and a bunch of potions boosting vitality. Quen isn't a lot of good because this isn't one attack, it's like 100 or thereabouts. The obvious thing to do here would be to roll to the side to avoid the attack, but despite many attempts, I just couldn't figure out the timing. I tried rolling forwards to see if the iframes would help, but that didn't work either. In the end, the problem seemed to simply be a poor camera angle or visual representation of the attack. I found that if I ran as far away as possible and angled the camera in a particular way, the attack became pretty easy to dodge. I just don't know why you can't do it from a bit closer up. On a very minor note, I started to get a bit annoyed with the fist fighting in Blood and Wine. I didn't bother with the fist fighting tournaments in the base game, but decided to give them a go here. Plus there were a few mandatory ones dotted around in quests. You might expect the early game fist fights to be much like the end game ones, assuming Geralt is always the same level as the enemy, but that's not the case. The way the enemy scaling works, the higher level enemies can take a hell of a lot of damage, and if they hit Geralt, they knock off a large portion of his health bar. The same thing does apply in regular combat, but it's mitigated there because Geralt can use all his potions and signs to give himself an advantage. Potions and signs aren't usually allowed in fistfights, so you get the silly scenario where Geralt has to land 20 punches on some drunken bandit to knock him down, whereas the same drunken bandit can send Geralt sprawling with an aggressive tickle. Despite that, all is forgiven because CD Projekt Red uses one of the fistfighting tournaments to pay homage to one of my favourite point-and-click adventure games from the mid-90s. The fight against Mancomb is a battle of put-downs, a test of wits. It's a spin on the Guybrush Threepwood fight from The Secret of Monkey Island. I wish the rest of the fights here had been as interesting. Unfortunately, the spin on the next fight is that it turns out you're fighting a woman, which was predictable and, as Geralt points out, not that big a deal at all, and something we've done lots of times before. And in the third fight you can win by parrying attacks 3 times on the trot. Bit of a letdown after such a strong start. As I mentioned earlier, money started to become a bit of a struggle in the DLC. There are certainly ways to farm money if you need to. The soldiers in the big Hansa camps tend to have valuable weapons, and so long as you don't kill the big boss they do keep respawning. If you're prepared to keep trekking back and forth between the camp and the merchant with all the money, you can certainly make enough to buy all the new fancy sets of gear. Otherwise though, you're going to find things a bit tight. I always thought the economy of The Witcher 3 was a little off, so to speak, but I didn't mind it that much because I could just about afford what I needed if I put a bit of effort in. Sure, the rewards for completing big jobs might not always match the effort, and the cost of wine was extortionate compared to what you could get for selling a big fancy sword. but so long as I had a lot of big fancy swords to sell, it didn't seem to be something worth getting my knickers in a twist about. In Blood and Wine, my knickers ended up well and truly twisted, partly due to all the money I spent on home improvement, but mainly due to the new Grandmaster gear sets. In the video on the base game, I discussed how I stuck to the feline gear to add a little extra challenge and minimise the need to switch gear. I stuck with that for the DLC with the exception of a few hours where I equipped an especially good steel sword. Upgrading to Grandmaster gear in theory is the same as with the other gear sets, in that you have to first go out and find the diagrams in the wild, then give them to the correct blacksmith who crafts what you need. The two main differences are that the Grandmaster gear now activates set bonuses based on how many pieces you're wearing, and it's incredibly expensive. For example, each piece of armour requires at least one piece of enriched dimeritium plate, and that costs about 4,500 gold. To put that into context, your final monetary reward at the very end of this DLC, when you've saved the Queen and defeated the beast, is 5,000 gold. So around one piece of the plate you need with a bit left over to pay for the actual crafting. To be fair, there are some cheaper ways to get the plate, such as crafting it yourself instead of buying it. Crafting it requires 2 enriched dimeritium ingots, and each of them costs about 2,250 gold. So it's the same price to buy 2 ingots and then craft a piece of plate as it is to just buy the plate. Actually, it's more expensive because the act of crafting costs money. However, if you keep following the list down and crafting things that are used to make other things, that are used to make other things, that are used to make enriched dimeritium ingots, you do eventually save some money. Mind you, the blacksmiths only have a limited amount of the rare materials you need to craft, so don't expect to be able to do this all in one hit. Like I said, it's not so much that the gear is too expensive. It's the best gear in the game. It should cost a lot of money. It's just that it feels disproportionate to the rewards. Completing the Blood and Wine story really should net you a lot more than 5,000 gold. Who cares if it messes up the economy at this point? The first half of the Queen's payment was an entire winery. The second half should be more than a contribution towards a new set of boots. Alternatively, it would have been nice if we could have used the winery to maybe generate a small income. A slight improvement gear-wise is that some of these special swords given as quest rewards are actually worth equipping, even if only briefly. Most notably, you can get Erondite back from its position at the bottom of a lake that Geralt is somehow able to walk on. He's jokingly chastised for not looking after it properly last time. In my case, I initially imported the sword into my Witcher 2 save, but it was then taken near the start of the game when Geralt was arrested. The special silver sword is returned to Geralt via the Lady of the Lake from the first game. That first experience with the Lady of the Lake seems like such a long time ago now. This time last year I was just starting to read the books for the first time, and now Blood and Wine brings the story to a close in spectacular fashion. Sure, the story has its issues and it's not quite a full standalone game as I've heard some people say, but it might just be the most entertaining 30-hour stretch I've had with the game. Not quite all killer no filler, but close enough.
Just wonderful.
My critiques of the Witcher games haven't touched on price much. It's never really been appropriate. The first 2 games are nearly always on sale for a couple of dollars, and the Game of the Year edition of The Witcher 3 is usually $15. However, I do think it's worth emphasising just what incredible value the DLC and indeed the base game were at full price. A season pass for a AAA title usually costs $40. Regardless of how much I end up liking any DLC, I can think of very few pieces that justify being 2/3 of the purchase price of the base game. There's rarely enough content to justify being sold separately for $40. However, for some reason the value proposition is easily overlooked when it comes to DLC. Perhaps it's because only the hardcore fans are buying it in the first place, or more likely I expect the fact that the content is often drip fed out over a year, at which point the season pass has already gone on sale, helps disguise what terrible value the season pass usually is. Not so here. If you purchase Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine separately at the highest price you would have paid $25, although both were available as a pack for $20. That's 1/3 of the price of the base game. A crude hours played comparison puts my time with the DLC at just under half my time with the base game, and while that doesn't speak to quality necessarily, I have no qualm saying that the DLC is at least on par with the base game in that respect. $20 for one incredible story in Hearts of Stone and an incredible new world and almost a new game in Blood of Wine is ridiculously good value, and I do think it's worth highlighting that even though these critiques don't generally consider price as an important factor. Oh, and there was a bunch of free micro DLC in there as well. The value proposition now is ridiculous. Borderline insulting, really. $15 for easily 150 hours in one of the best games ever made, with terrific writing and production values throughout, and a lot more hours if you want to engage with the filler content. I don't think there is a better way to spend $15 on a video game. I know I found the combat frustrating at times, but as I said in the Witcher 3 video, I don't entirely understand the expectations around this. I went into The Witcher 3 expecting to play an RPG. I've played a lot of RPGs in my time, and rarely did I ever find the combat fun enough that I would want to engage with it outside of the wider story. Stripped of everything else, I know I would rather play with The Witcher 3's combat system than, say, Skyrim's any day, and yet I don't hear anywhere near as many people say they stopped playing Skyrim early on because they found the combat too dull. Perhaps the term RPG is thrown around too lightly to be of any use anymore. Publishers stick the label on any game with a skill tree these days, so it's almost meaningless, but even then I'd say most of the similar open world action games don't have particularly special combat. Recent Assassin's Creed games have certainly come a long way, although Origins came out after The Witcher 3 and it's hardly a night and day improvement if it's an improvement at all. I've always enjoyed the GTA games despite them having frankly terrible shooting mechanics and inconsistent driving. The Fallout games have improved at combat over time, and yet the games themselves are worse because people play Fallout for the story. I just don't get the extreme reactions around The Witcher 3 in this respect, and likely I never will. Mind you, playing Witcher 1 sure does make you appreciate Witcher 3. It's incredible how much this series progressed in the roughly 10-year period from starting work on The Witcher 1 to publishing The Witcher 3. From the PC-only first game that treated combat like a rhythm game and had about 6 character models, to the second game which bravely decided to forego the traditional bigger and longer approach sequels usually take to be 2 smaller games in one, to the third entry that went on to become one of the best-selling video games ever made. That's not bad for a 100-hour RPG that was carrying forward a story from 2 games most people hadn't played, and those games were in turn carrying on a story from 8 books that very few people outside of Poland had read at the time. In case you couldn't tell from all the time I've spent talking about these games, I thoroughly enjoyed them and highly recommend you play them if you can. I will admit the games can be a slow burn. In fact, I'm not sure at any point did I excitedly boot up my computer to play more of the games. You sort of need a little nudge to get started each time, but once you start, the games draw you gently into the world and they do not make it easy to leave. My recommendation is simply that you spend as much time with this world as you are reasonably able to. I appreciate that the first 2 games aren't all that accessible. If you only own a PS4, you're out of luck, and even if you can play them, you might find it hard to get into them, especially the first one. But I promise any time you do spend with them will be rewarded. Obviously read or listen to the books if you can. I don't particularly believe any one of the books is the greatest thing ever written, but they aren't especially long for fantasy books, and as a collective whole they are more than the sum of their parts. And watch the TV show too, of course. I'm usually fairly reserved when it comes to asking for spin-offs and sequels, probably because I watched Joey back when that was a thing. However, I do genuinely believe there is a lot of potential for non-Geralt related games here. My first choice would probably be a Regis spin-off. There's an excellent scene where Regis is fighting guards alongside Geralt, and let's just say that Geralt isn't the one doing the majority of the legwork. Regis has the potential for some incredibly fun combat, and given that he's hundreds of years old and will live for hundreds more, such a story could be set long before or after the events of these games. Plus there's enough in Blood and Wine and the books to show that the vampires of this world are incredibly interesting, and I'd love to learn more about them. Of course I wouldn't say no to more Ciri adventures either. Finally, and I appreciate that this will sound a little cheesy, I want to thank CD Projekt Red for what they've accomplished here. Again, I'm not usually the type to throw around praise to a large corporate entity for selling me a product, but the Witcher series does such a good job of hiding the corporate side of things and being a great piece of art. All games are art. They don't all feel like art. CD Projekt Red is now one of the largest developers in the world, and that's pretty much just off the back of this one series, and I can't argue they don't deserve the success. Alright, it looks like I am finally done with the Witcher series. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have, perhaps you could hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share the video where all the cool kids hang out. I also have a Patreon where you can get your name in the credits, and a Patreon role in my Discord server for only $1 a month. The Discord server is open to all, and I do lots of game giveaways in there, so come and hang out. I have a couple of ideas for a new series of games to cover, but this is the time to make suggestions in the comments if there are a particular game series you'd like to see me cover. Bear in mind that isometric CRPGs are already being covered in a separate series. The next couple of videos will be on Splinter Cell Conviction and then the Shadowrun games. Everything else is up in the air and subject to change. Okay, until next time, cheers.